Hey everybody, and welcome to the Unseen Wisdom. Before we get started, please take a sec to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future deep dives. Today we're taking a closer look at a story that's been making waves in the news. It's coming straight out of South Africa, where their president just signed a law that's, well, stirred up a whole lot of controversy.
Oh yeah, this one's a biggie.
We're talking about expropriation without compensation.
Or EWC for short. Catchy, right?
Definitely a headline grabber. It's a pretty bold move, and as you can imagine, it's got folks talking, debating, and even a little worried about what this means, not just for South Africa, but for the world. So we're going to break it all down for you. What exactly is EWC? Why is it causing such a ruckus? And what are the potential upsides and downsides everyone's buzzing about?
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's try to make this real for everyone listening. Imagine, just for a second, that the government decides to take your property, the land you own, without giving you a dime for it.
Gone, just like that.
Poof. And their reason. They've decided it's in the public interest. That, my friends, is EWC in a nutshell. And yeah, you can bet it's raising eyebrows all over the place.
And it's not just the taking without paying part that's got people riled up. You got to factor in the historical context here.
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about EWC without acknowledging the past.
Right. EWC often pops up in countries that are still grappling with the aftermath of colonialism and apartheid, places like South Africa where land was seized from indigenous populations, creating these huge inequalities that persist today. So for some, EWC is seen as a way to try to right those historical wrongs.
It's like trying to balance the scales after centuries of injustice.
Exactly. But of course, there's the other side of the coin. The worries about property rights, economic stability, the very foundations of a fair and reliable legal system.
Right, because if the government could just take your land, what does that say about the security of your assets?
It definitely throws a wrench in the whole idea of predictable, stable laws that everyone can rely on. No doubt about it. It's a tricky situation, trying to address past wrongs without creating new ones. And that's why it's so important to understand the different viewpoints swirling around EWC.
Absolutely. So let's start with those who are in favor of this policy. We've been digging into the stance of the African National Congress, the ANC, which is the ruling party in South Africa. What's their take on this whole thing?
Well, the ANC is framing this new law as a crucial move towards aligning their laws with their constitution. They're basically saying, hey, this is about making things right. And a big part of that is how they define public interest.
Public interest? That sounds pretty broad.
It is. Traditionally, it might have meant stuff like building roads or, infrastructure projects, the kind of stuff that benefits everyone. But now
They're widening the scope.
big time. The ANC is saying that public interest now includes things like land reform and, get this, overall societal transformation.
Whoa, that's a pretty significant shift. So it's not just about physical infrastructure anymore. It's about reshaping the very fabric of society.
Exactly. And that means the government's power to acquire land just got a whole lot bigger.
I can see why some people might be feeling uneasy about that. It's a lot of power concentrated in the hands of the government.
You got it. And to add fuel to the fire, the ANC is also stressing that they want to use this law to deal with situations where land is just sitting there, abandoned, or being used for speculation.
Speculation? You mean like people buying up land, not to use it, but just hoping its value will go up so they can sell it for a profit?
Bingo. The ANC argues that this kind of behavior drives up land prices, making it harder for ordinary folks to get their hands on some property. They're saying that with EWC, they can take that unused or speculated on land and put it to better use, maybe for social or economic development projects that benefit more people.
So from their perspective, it's about righting past wrongs, promoting development, and making sure land is actually being USED, not just sitting idle. But as we all know, there's always more than one side to every story. And in this case, the folks who oppose EWC are painting a much bleaker picture. They're talking about potential pitfalls and warning about some pretty dire consequences.
Oh, yeah. They're not holding back. A lot of the pushback is about the potential economic fallout. Some critics are even going so far as to compare it to what happened in Zimbabwe after their own land redistribution policies.
Zimbabwe. That doesn't sound good.
Not at all. They went through some serious economic hardship, and these critics are worried that EWC could trigger something similar in South Africa. They fear it'll scare off investors, both local and foreign, leading to capital flight and general instability.
Capital flight, meaning people and businesses pulling their money out of the country because they're scared of what might happen.
Exactly. And it's not just a hunch. There are some pretty compelling arguments to back up these fears. We've been looking into the work of a legal expert, Martin Van Staden, and he's not mincing words.
Lay it on us.
He straight up calls EWC confiscation. No sugarcoating there. He argues that it goes against the basic principles of a free market economy. You know, the whole idea that people have the right to own private property.
Which is a cornerstone of many Western legal systems.
Exactly. Van Staden's point is that if people are worried that the government can just snatch their property without compensation, they're going to be a lot less likely to invest. Why risk it, right?
Makes sense. If you don't feel secure in your ownership, why would you put your money into something that could be taken away from you?
Precisely. And he goes even further, saying that this whole thing will create a climate of distrust between the government and its citizens, which, you know, never ends well for the economy.
It sounds like a recipe for instability and uncertainty, which are never good for business or the overall well-being of a country.
Right on. And it's not just economists who are waving red flags. Political commentators like Chris Wyatt are also jumping into the fray. They're worried that this law could be used as a political weapon.
A political weapon? What do you mean by that?
Well, they're saying that EWC could be used to silence people who criticize the government or to target specific groups who might be seen as opponents. Basically, a way to control people through fear.
So it's not just about the economics, it's about potential abuses of power and the erosion of basic freedoms.
Exactly. The concern is that EWC could create this downward spiral where declining investment leads to economic hardship, and then that fuels social unrest and instability, which could then be used to justify even more authoritarian measures. It's a scary thought.
Definitely a worst-case scenario we need to consider.
Right.
But even setting aside the potential for abuse, there's still the question of whether the government can actually pull this off effectively and fairly, even with the best of intentions. And then there's the economic freedom fighters.
The EFF. Now, that's where things get really interesting.
Because they're a left-wing party known for being vocal about land reform. You'd think they'd be over the moon about this new law, right?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But they're actually against it.
No way. What's their beef with it?
They're saying it doesn't go far enough. They believe it fails to address the root cause of the problem, which they see as the fundamentally unequal distribution of land ownership in South Africa.
So even those who are passionate about land reform are divided on this issue. What exactly is the EFF proposing?
Their solution is way more radical. They want complete nationalization of all land in South Africa.
Whoa, nationalization. That's a pretty big leap. So they're basically saying all land should be owned by the government.
Exactly. They argue it's the only way to truly break the legacy of apartheid and create a more equal society. They want a total reset on land ownership.
It's a bold proposition, to say the least. It shows just how complex this issue is, with even those who want land reform disagreeing on how to achieve it.
Absolutely. And it raises a really important question. Can the government even implement EWC effectively and fairly?
Yeah, that's a huge question mark. I mean, even with the best of intentions, can they manage such a massive undertaking without running into problems like corruption or mismanagement?
It's a valid concern. And there's a story in the news that's fueling this skepticism. It involves a suspected illegal mining kingpin, they call him Tiger. He was allegedly involved in a mining accident and got trapped underground.
Sounds intense. What happened to him?
Well, they managed to bring him to the surface during a rescue operation, but before the police could take him into custody, he vanished.
He just disappeared. Poof.
Gone. Vanished into thin air. Nobody knows what happened.
That's wild. And not exactly reassuring.
Right. If someone like Tiger can just disappear from police custody, it makes you wonder about the competence and integrity of the whole system.
It definitely casts a shadow over the government's ability to manage something as complex and potentially contentious as EWC. If they can't even keep track of a high-profile suspect, how can people trust them to handle land redistribution fairly and transparently?
It's a valid point. This whole incident just amplifies the concerns about transparency and accountability. If those issues are already present in the existing system, how can we be sure they won't plague the implementation of EWC as well?
It's like a microcosm of the bigger worries surrounding this policy. It raises the question, even if EWC is well-intentioned, can the government actually make it work? Can they implement it in a way that truly benefits those who have been historically disadvantaged without opening the door to corruption, bias, or just plain incompetence?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And frankly, right now, nobody has the answers. It's a gamble, a high-stakes game with potentially huge implications not just for South Africa, but for the world.
It's a story that's unfolding right before our eyes, and it's definitely one worth watching closely. The stakes are incredibly high, and the potential outcomes, both positive and negative, are vast.
Welcome back to The Unseen Wisdom. We've been laying out the whole EWC situation in South Africa, diving into the history and the arguments flying back and forth.
It's a lot to unpack, right? But now I think it's time to zoom out a bit, look at the bigger picture. What does South Africa's EWC gamble mean for the rest of the world?
Yeah, good point. This isn't just a South African story, it's a global one. And you can bet a lot of eyes are on South Africa right now, especially in countries that are grappling with similar issues, legacies of colonialism, land inequality, all that.
Makes sense. They're watching to see how this plays out.
Exactly. If South Africa somehow manages to pull this off, implement EWC in a way that actually promotes social justice and economic stability, well, that could be a game changer. It might encourage other countries to give EWC a serious look.
It's like a domino effect, but in a potentially good way, right? Like a positive ripple spreading outwards.
Right. But the flip side is, if things go south in South Africa, if EWC leads to economic turmoil and social unrest, well, that'll send a discreet message, a warning. It'll reinforce all those fears about EWC being too risky, too dangerous.
So it's a bit of a nail-biter.
Mm-hmm.
The whole world's watching to see if this bold move leads to progress or disaster.
Pretty much. And the outcome could have a ripple effect, on land reform policies across the globe.
No pressure, South Africa.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back down to earth for a second. What are some key takeaways for our listeners, no matter where they live?
Good question. I think first and foremost, this whole EWC debate highlights the fact that colonialism's legacy is still alive and kicking. Those deep inequalities that were created centuries ago, they haven't gone away. They're still shaping societies today.
It's like we're still dealing with the ghosts of the past.
Exactly. The fact that EWC is even on the table shows how urgently we need to address these historical wrongs. And not just in South Africa, but everywhere these injustices are still felt.
So, takeaway number one, the past isn't really past, it's shaping our present.
Absolutely. Takeaway number two. This situation in South Africa throws a spotlight on this really complex relationship between property rights, social justice, and economic development. There's no easy fix. It's like a three-way tug of war.
And it's hard to find that sweet spot where everyone wins.
Right. You got it. Trying to balance those competing interests, it's tricky. And it forces us to ask some tough questions. What's more important, individual rights or societal needs? How do you achieve fairness without sacrificing stability?
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube where every twist affects everything else.
Perfect analogy. And finally, and this is crucial for everyone listening, this whole story is a reminder of how important it is to think critically, to engage in thoughtful discussion.
Not just reacting emotionally or jumping on bandwagons.
Right, exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the hype, the emotional rhetoric around EWC, but we gotta step back, look at all sides, weigh the potential risks and rewards. We gotta approach this issue with nuance and a genuine desire to understand.
Don't just swallow any one narrative whole. Do your own research, listen to different voices, and form your own informed opinion.
Right on.
Yeah.
Because that's where true understanding lies. In challenging our own assumptions and being open to learning from others, even those we disagree with.
So we've heard all the hopes and fears surrounding EWC. But let's get practical for a minute. What concrete steps could be taken to actually make this work, to minimize the risks, and maybe even achieve some of those potential benefits?
The million-dollar question. Well, for starters, you absolutely gotta have a transparent and accountable process for choosing which land gets expropriated. There needs to be a clear set of criteria, objective and fair, so it doesn't become a political tool or a way to settle scores.
It has to be about addressing historical injustice, not creating new ones.
Exactly. And you need strong legal safeguards, no question. People whose land is expropriated need to have the right to challenge the decision to make sure it's legit. There needs to be due process, oversight, checks and balances, the whole shebang.
Basically, you need to prevent abuses of power and make sure individual rights are protected.
Spot on. And just as important, there has to be genuine community engagement. You can't just impose this from above. The people who are most affected by EWC, especially those from historically disadvantaged communities, they need to have a say in how this all goes down.
It's about empowering people, giving them a voice in their own future. Because if they don't feel like they're part of the process, the whole thing is doomed to fail.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Without genuine buy-in from the communities involved, EWC risks becoming just another empty promise, another top-down initiative that doesn't actually change anything on the ground.
It's about collaboration, not dictation. It's about bringing people together to find solutions that work for everyone.
Precisely. And that collaboration needs to involve not just the government, but also civil society groups, legal experts, economists, and most importantly, the communities themselves.
It's a complex puzzle, and solving it requires input from a whole bunch of different stakeholders.
Absolutely. And even then, even with the best intentions and the most carefully crafted policies, there are no guarantees. EWC is a gamble, a high-stakes one, and only time will tell whether it pays off.
It's a real cliffhanger, isn't it?
Yeah.
The future of South Africa, and maybe even the world, hangs in the balance. We've covered a lot of ground here, talked about the history, the arguments, the potential global implications. But before we wrap up this deep dive on EWC, I think it's important to remember one crucial thing.
Yeah, you're right. We can't lose sight of the human element in all of this.
Exactly. It's easy to get caught up in the policy debates and economic projections and all that, but at the end of the day, this is about people. Real people whose lives are going to be directly affected by how EWC is implemented.
Absolutely. And we've talked about the potential benefits for historically disadvantaged communities, which is a huge part of the story, no doubt. But we also need to think about those who might lose their land.
Right. The other side of the coin, those who might not see this as a positive change.
Exactly. And that raises some tough questions, How do you balance the pursuit of a greater good with the potential for causing harm to individuals? How do you make sure that in trying to fix past injustices, you don't create new ones?
It's a tightrope walk, for sure. And it's important to remember that for many people, land ownership is about more than just money. It's about heritage, cultural identity, a sense of belonging.
Oh, absolutely. For some, their land has been passed down through generations. It's tied to their family history, their ancestors. It's more than just an economic asset. It's part of who they are.
So taking that away, even with compensation, can be a deeply emotional and disruptive experience. It can feel like a violation, a loss of something precious.
You got it. And that's why this whole issue is so ethically complex. How do you weigh the need for redress, for social justice, against the potential for causing pain and displacement to individuals?
Well, no easy answer, is there?
Not really. It requires a really nuanced approach. One that considers the specific circumstances of each case and makes sure that the most vulnerable people are protected. It's got to be about more than just following a set of rules. It's got to be about compassion and understanding.
And that's where communication comes in, right?
Yeah.
Engaging with communities, listening to their concerns, understanding their needs and aspirations.
Exactly. You can't just impose this from the top down. Successful land reform, if that's the goal, has to involve genuine collaboration, trust building, a commitment to finding solutions that work for everyone involved. It's a process, not an event.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into EWC in South Africa, I think it's safe to say we're left with more questions than answers.
Yeah, that's often the case with these complex issues, isn't it? The more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Asking those tough questions, wrestling with those ethical dilemmas, that's how we grow, how we learn, how we move forward.
I couldn't agree more. And that's the beauty of this whole EWC story. It forces us to confront some really fundamental questions about property, about justice, about the legacy of colonialism, about the kind of world we want to live in.
It's a story that's still being written, and the ending is far from certain. But one thing's for sure. The outcome of South Africa's experiment with EWC is going to have implications far beyond its borders. It's a case study that the whole world is watching.
Absolutely. It's a global conversation, and everyone has a stake in it.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into expropriation without compensation in South Africa. We've covered a lot of ground, explored different perspectives, wrestled with some tough questions, but most importantly, we hope we've sparked your curiosity, challenged your thinking, and maybe even inspired you to dig deeper into this issue on your own.
It's been a fascinating journey, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Likewise. And thanks to all of you for tuning into the Unseen Wisdom. Remember, knowledge is power, but wisdom lies in what we do with that knowledge. So stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged. We'll see you next time.